Today, Sharon Martin joins us to talk about codependency, what that looks like. We also deep dive into people pleasing and how to set boundaries.
Well, I'm Sharon Martin, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have been for over 20 years. So I've been in practice for a long time at this point. I'm based in Northern California near San Francisco, although my practice is currently online. But I have enjoyed working in a variety of different settings over the years, but I've been focusing on my private practice probably 10 or so years now. Which has been lovely and really given me the opportunity to, dig into some of the clinical issues that are of most interest to me, which tend to be things around codependency and relationship issues, which is, when we can talk more about codependency, but I think it's interesting because it's very much about one's relationship with themselves, but also relationships with other people as well. And it kind of connects to a lot of other issues around, everything from self-esteem to setting boundaries to anxiety and perfectionism and, a sense of self and feeling worthy. So I think there's a lot of different pieces there that people can relate to and connect with the idea of just sort of a general feeling of, I would say if I had to sum it all up, sort of not feeling good enough and feeling like there must be something wrong with me that's at the core of this. And for a lot of folks, not really understanding where that's coming from or what that's really about. And so again, I think there's a lot of self-criticism, self-blame that ends up being the result of that. And then, once we can sort of uncover what the roots of it are, I think one thing is, people often feel a lot of relief just realizing they're not the only person struggling with these kinds of feelings and experiences. But then I think also understanding that it makes sense from the standpoint of like, we can understand why you end up feeling like there's something wrong with you, even though there's not, right? Like there's something that's very normalizing about understanding that, we often do things in adulthood that were the result of challenging things that happened to us earlier in life. And so we developed some coping skills that, worked reasonably well or were the best that we could come up with at the time. But right now as adults, sometimes they start to get, cause us some problems, and that's, again, there's something I think wonderful about understanding that now we have more options. There are other things that we can do that maybe can, help us deal with life struggles more effectively than some of those, things we figured out when we were kids.
Definitely. I think you make such a great point. It's like, is there something wrong with me? What's going on? But really, we're just going, hey, like these are the skills that you learned earlier in life, but they're just no longer working today. And so let's dig into that, see if we can find new ways to handle the challenges or the experiences you're having currently.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So like what made you kind of step into the boundaries and the codependency fields? Like what kind of was attractive to you in that area?
Oh, I always think that's such a great question. And I suspect the answer is similar for probably any therapist that you ask this question to. Is there's a certain amount of it that is us trying to figure our own selves out, right? There are issues that resonate for us on a personal level. So I can definitely, identify with, some of those kinds of struggles myself. And I think that's probably a large part of the attraction to, any sort of specialty is, thinking, okay, like this, I want to understand myself. And in doing so, I can sort of understand this larger issue that a lot of people struggle with as well. So, again, I think over the years, it's been sort of uncovering, different layers of myself and trying to understand why I do the things that I do. Right. And in doing so, right, it's like, okay, I see, the pieces of the perfectionism and the anxiety and, the wanting to please people and, sometimes, kind of sacrificing what's best for me and doing what is going to make other people happy and feeling, guilty if other people are upset with me. So, I can relate to all of that. So I think there's a large part of it that's that like I said, I think that's fairly common.
Totally, for sure. It's like that, like you said, that self-investigation so that you can really relate to the material and then you dive into it because it's personally interesting, but it's also really
Yeah.
professionally interesting. And then that's how you kind of start down this route.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. So would you mind just maybe explaining or expressing around like what is codependency? Because I don't know about you, but I find it's a bit of a buzzword lately.
Yes, and I will try, but I also think you're right. I mean, it's very hard to have a succinct definition because it's fairly complex.
Mhm.
And it is something that it's both wonderful. I think that people have some familiarity with it and they use the word. And I think the definition has also changed over the years, for sure, from when it was originally used. And it's actually probably not technically the best word for what we're talking about, I think, in our current context today. But with all that being said, I think there's a couple of core pieces of it that we want to think about. And one is that when we're talking about codependency, we're really talking about somebody who is focusing so much on another person problems or feelings that they lose sight of who they are themselves as an individual. And so there's an element that I would say is sort of a loss of self. And for some people, this is really that they never developed a strong sense of an independent self to begin with. They always felt like they were sort of an extension of a parent or a partner, and it was very much about catering to that other person. Again, either trying to make them happy or prevent them from being angry with you, or trying to help them with a problem. And again, like historically, we've looked, we've thought about codependency in terms of addiction on somebody who has an addiction or maybe a mental illness. But over the years, we've definitely come to understand that codependency can exist in a whole range of different, scenarios. And so that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, but it is often true that people who struggle with codependency end up in relationships with people who have, some problems that they're struggling a lot of the time. And the codependent is sort of the one who wants to get in there and try to solve it and rescue the person. And, and so this can kind of lead into, I think, often well-meaning, but sort of overstepping some of those boundaries at times. And, things like giving unwanted advice or being somewhat controlling, telling people what they should be doing or being frustrated that they're not, taking the steps that you think they need to take in order to, get better or resolve the problem that they're having. So there tends to be this, sort of imbalance or lopsided nature to the relationship. And of course, what ends up happening is in this situation, the person sort of we're identifying as the codependent. Again, this is sort of where we're being not quite technically accurate because truly both people are the codependents. It gets very confusing to talk about things that way. So we tend to talk about sort of the helper, if you will, as the codependent. But this kind of relationship ends up being completely unsatisfying for folks, even though they are getting something out of sort of that helping role, the feeling needed. It sort of fuels a piece of one's self-esteem. But ultimately, your needs are never getting met in this relationship, right? Because there's so much of the focus is on the other person and what do they need and how can I meet their needs, that for codependents, they end up in relationships often with people who aren't very good at saying, hey, what do you need? And reciprocating. But the codependent also is very unfamiliar, with this idea of saying, hey, I need something here. My needs are valid. I need there to be a give and take in this relationship, right? Because that's what actually makes a satisfying relationship is that, there's compromises and, we both give and we both take in a relationship. Mm-hmm. But so much of it is giving, and then the codependent ends up depleted, resentful. They don't take good care of themselves often. And there can almost be a, sort of a sense of victimhood, even though the codependent has willingly, sort of stepped into this role in this relationship, there's often a feeling of like, poor me, there's nothing I can do. I'm being taken advantage of without a real maybe awareness that we're allowing that to happen, right? That we're not setting boundaries and saying, hey, this is not okay. I don't want to be treated this way, or I need something in this relationship, which means you can't always get what you need. So again, we've got that, that relationship that's unfulfilling for folks.
Yeah, for sure. So you really spoke about how it's on both sides of things, right? Because there's the one person not getting their needs met and the other person not really even being open maybe to giving those needs to get met in the first place.
Right. Sure. In any relationship, there ends up being sort of a system, a pattern that gets established. And, without us even realizing it, we sort of get into these patterns of behavior with people. And so the circumstances might change, but the dynamics tend to be repetitive. That, like I said, one person is trying to, help or fix the other person. And then the other person either, sometimes doesn't even want that help, and then they're unhappy with it. And, you feel like you're taken advantage of, and you don't know how to ask for what you need. And again, the other thing that's important to remember is although a lot of this is a dynamic that will show up in a relationship, codependency really exists within us, sort of in terms of a set of behaviors or traits, or maybe even ways of thinking, even when we're not in a close relationship with somebody, because sometimes people will ask, is it really that the relationship is codependent, or is it, the person? And I would say, it tends to be, something, again, a pattern that people will repeat in different relationships for one thing. But even if you're not in a close relationship, with an intimate partner, it can happen with friends, it can happen with adult children, parents, all kinds of relationships. But we also know that, we're sort of, if you will, sort of compelled, towards doing some of these things or thinking about ourselves in a particular way, regardless of the relationship status.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to highlight one of those things you said, that codependency can happen in many types of relationships, because I think when we think of codependent or codependency with that buzzword kind of idea, it's usually we have it in that romantic relationship sense. So I think that's a really great clarification to bring up.
Yeah. And that's sort of back to the origins of it. It was originally a term that was attributed to the wives of alcoholic men. And of course, we've moved beyond that in many senses. But I see a lot of it between adult children and their parents, that there's, sort of a connection there that I almost want to say they sort of haven't quite grown out of, a sense of that the child, even though they're an adult, has not been allowed to or able to, sort of fully individuate, become, their own complete person who feels like it's okay for them to, make their own decisions or displease their parents, or, make choices, have different values, really have that sense of like, I am an adult and I can do what I want. And an understanding that they can tolerate having their parents be maybe unhappy with them or disappointed or just disagree about certain things. And so again, for the child, it ends up feeling like, sort of constrained. I'm still, having to do, or I'm choosing to, however you want to frame it, right, is that I'm still doing things to try to make my parents happy, even if though these things don't really work for me, or they don't really align with who I think I might be at this point in my life.
For sure. Could you give maybe a tangible example?
Yeah. Well, oh boy, so many. I will just see, adults choosing to, say yes to things that their parents want to do, whether it's like, we want to go on a family vacation with you and your children, and, have this, 3-generation, and the child is like, this is not at all what I want. I know it's not going to be enjoyable, but I feel like I need to do it because it's what my parents want. Or it could be something about, I would say, maybe they have a different set of values, whether it's politics or religion, and they really, don't want to, continue to maybe practice, the same faith that their parents want them to. I've even seen things around careers where people have felt like, their parents want them to pursue a particular career path, and then they do it, and they are, as we would, guess, they end up completely miserable doing something that they didn't ever want to do, but it was what their parents wanted them to do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or even, I think, a choice of partner sometimes is another big one. And again, it's definitely, I think it's hard for almost everybody to do something that they know that their parents aren't going to agree with. There is something, I don't know, almost sort of fundamental, I think, about us wanting to have our parents' approval. Mm-hmm. But like I said, I think we have to be able to make that distinction between, when that makes sense and when that doesn't make sense, and when it's actually harmful for us to do that. And I think sometimes we essentially underestimate ourselves, like with the idea that we're not going to be able to, tolerate the discomfort of having our parents be upset with us, or that we're not going to be able to repair things. And again, this is often because if we've never done it, right? If you've gotten to 30 or 40 years old, and you've been always compromising to make somebody else happy, and now you're trying to, make a shift there, it's hard. It's not something that's going to be like you can flip the switch and just say, oh, okay, now it's fine. It's okay if they're upset with me, because again, there's often a dynamic that sort of keeps this in place. Whereas, like, you can imagine if you're the adult who is, trying to tell your parents that you don't want to go on vacation with them, or you don't want to, come to Christmas dinner at their house, often, the parents would then respond in a way that makes it, increasingly difficult for you to say no to them. Right? They say things that make you feel guilty, and, so on. There's sort of a level of manipulation that ends up happening to try to maintain that, that status quo of that, sort of codependent relationship tendency.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there's any links between codependency and different cultures? Like, is it only a cultural thing, or like, is there some variance across cultures?
Well, it's a great question. And I don't fully know the answer because I haven't studied really codependency across cultures. But to me, it definitely feels like, that we're looking at it through a lens of, predominantly a Western, set of values, and that cultural piece there. And we do tend to be an individualistic society. So, right, you can kind of get that sense that what we're talking about is that it's okay, right? From our value system, it's okay, and it's healthy psychologically for people to make choices that are for their own benefit. And, we're not saying that we should disregard, other people's feelings or ideas or values. It's not that, we're not talking about things to that extreme, but we're definitely, applying a value system here. And again, it is a term, as far as I know, that that is a term that was developed in American culture. So I think it would look different, and it would not, some of these things would not necessarily be seen as problematic. I think in many cultures, it would sort of be the flip side, right? Totally. Right, where it would seem very odd for people to be setting boundaries with their parents, or, a lot of the things that we consider to be healthy or important, developmental milestones are very much ones that are geared towards us becoming independent of our parents in a lot of ways.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Sure.
So, it is, like I said, I think it's a fantastic question. And I think it's something that's really important for us to think about, as clinicians, when we're working with people who are coming from different places, have different cultural backgrounds. And, we've got, so many folks who, first or second generation, in this country that, we want to be mindful that we're not trying to force our value system onto them, or trying to, say that something is, pathological or somehow it's wrong because of the value system and a cultural mindset that we have. I think we definitely need to be, thinking about truly, looking at and assessing, what is working or not working for an individual or in a particular family, so that it's not, so clear cut that, A, B, or C means that this is a problem. Because, I think as you're pointing out, with the question is that, some of these things are not problematic for everybody. And if they're not, great. It's really right. What we're really talking about is trying to make some shifts when or if some of these behaviors or, family systems kinds of issues are causing you to feel distress, physical or emotional distress, if you, feel unsatisfied in some of your significant relationships, you're angry or you're resentful. I mean, those are all cues that, okay, something's going on here, that it's not working for you, and it probably needs some attention. But if that's not the case, then I certainly would not want to suggest to somebody that, they should be, taking a quiz or looking at a checklist and saying, oh, they have these, behaviors, that means it's a problem, right? It's very important that we say only if it's actually causing problems for you in your life that you need to make a change.
For sure. And that's like clearing up some of the misconceptions. Like, you're not necessarily codependent if you're spending all your time with someone. It's only if you're spending all of your time and it's causing those challenges or problems as a result.
Yeah. Again, I think there's a lot of, sort of the pop psychology that, we see today. And, there's great things about, getting some of this information on Instagram or TikTok, but it is often oversimplified to the point where, right, sometimes it is as simple as that somebody will think, oh, well, if you're, spending, all day long with, your new boyfriend or girlfriend or, significant other, that's necessarily a problem. Not necessarily, right? It might be or it might not be. And that's where, we need to, sort of do a little more critical analysis to really look at that and look at the whole context of it, I think, for folks.
Definitely. I think you make a really good point, because we get a lot of our information sometimes from certain places, but we don't actually go, wait, is this actually what's happening to me? How can I best get supported to make sure I'm figuring out what's working for me and what's not working for me, and have a bit more clarity around that?
Yeah, definitely.
Are there certain mental health challenges that you find are really prevalent when someone is experiencing codependency?
Probably anxiety is one of the primary ones. And I would say, often one of the sort of hallmarks of a codependent relationship or some codependency is that there is a significant level of, I would say, both thinking about the other person, but often worrying about them. And so there's, there may be like some worry, some rumination, some sleepless nights. Again, it's sort of like you're not able to completely separate what's going on for somebody else in their life. And sometimes that's, of course, because what they're doing is affecting you. Again, like, if you have a partner who's drinking too much, I mean, that is their problem, but it certainly impacts you. So it's not that like it's wrong or, unusual that you would be worried about that situation. But there is often, some level of anxious thinking that is going on with it. And I would say there's often just sort of an unsettled feeling. There's a sense of that idea, like when's the next shoe going to drop? Like there's always, a belief that something bad is going to happen. And again, a lot of folks who struggle with codependency have, experienced some kind of trauma. I would not say everybody, but a lot of folks have had some level of, trauma in their childhood. And so again, this makes perfect sense, right? If you grew up in an environment where things were, unpredictable or chaotic or scary at times, that you're going to have some level of anxiety that, continues with you. And there's, a level of sort of self-protection that's happening there. Like your body, your nervous system is like, okay, I need to be on alert because I want to be prepared for when the next bad thing happens. and again, sometimes that sort of translates into some of those controlling behaviors that I mentioned earlier, trying to, exert control or get people to do a particular thing, because then it feels less anxiety provoking for us, right? We feel like we're in control of the situation. We know what's going to happen. We don't need to worry about it as much, but unfortunately, it's not very effective, because often, I would say most of the time, we can't actually get people to do what we want them to do. So it's often an effort to feel some sense of control.
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Is there a prevalent fear of having the relationship end, or like a fear of abandonment?
Oh, yes, definitely. And that's another great point to make, that is often an element of that, sort of the people pleasing and the compromising and the doing things to, either make people happy or to, keep them from being angry with you, is because I would say sometimes that's a conscious thought, that I don't want to lose this person if they get angry with me, but it's probably more often an unconscious thought that, again, is sort of behind those behaviors. That's kind of driving that sense of, okay, I need to do everything that I can, to maintain this relationship and, take care of this other person, and be needed and be loved, because, if they get upset with me, or if, they don't need me to, do any of these things, then where's my place in this relationship, almost, I would say. So yeah, that is definitely a fear that is, back there for folks.
Is codependency similar to an anxious attachment style?
Yes, I would say, if we were to look at it through an attachment lens, that is where we would, land, right? So again, I mean, that is, again, sort of makes sense from that standpoint of, right, there's, what we would, describe as some anxiety in our thinking and in our behavior. But there's that. The anxious attachment is that sort of insecurity about the relationship, and about, whether the relationship is going to survive, essentially, and a sense that I really need it to, like that I'm not sure that I'm going to be okay, almost, if I don't have the relationship, if I don't have the other person's love and approval, which I think goes back to that feeling of inadequacy, or maybe there's something wrong with me that I need, sort of this, it's almost like an external validation, that comes through the relationship, that, the relationship assures me that I'm okay, right? That I'm lovable, essentially. There's something worthwhile about me. And again, you sort of connect that to that, the fear of abandonment, and you start to see how, the reverse of that is that, right, without the relationship, there's not a strong sense of self and self-worth.
So could an example be perhaps a person who stays in a relationship longer than they should because they're fearful that if they were not with that person, then their life would not be comfortable, they wouldn't be happy, despite, even though maybe getting not any of their needs really truly met.
Right. And almost that sense that sometimes, there's a belief that if this relationship ends, I'll never have another one. Like there isn't anybody else who's going to want me. It is often a fear that people will have as well, which again, right? You don't want, if you feel like this is sort of the best or the only relationship that you're ever going to have, then you're going to hold on to it, because you're getting something out of it, even though it's ultimately, an unsatisfying relationship. It's still a relationship, right? And that's unfortunately how a lot of people look at it. But it makes sense, again, when you really have, a negative view of yourself, then you're going to, unfortunately, make so many compromises in a relationship or just in life in general. You're going to do things, or not do things sometimes, that unfortunately can be harmful to you, right? That, you're not going to put up the boundaries, and you're not going to leave relationships that are actually physically or emotionally hurtful. So yes, they're absolutely, we probably, it's probably fairly accurate to say, that people who are in, what we would consider to be abusive relationships, that there is some level of codependency that's going on there. That's part of what's keeping them in that relationship. But again, it's complicated. And it's, I definitely don't want anybody listening to this to think that, that they're to blame, for staying, because again, staying makes sense, from so many standpoints. There are many, reasonable, logical reasons, to stay in relationships. That doesn't mean that they're good for us, or that, we shouldn't, figure out how to untangle ourselves from them. But it is definitely a complicated situation.
Definitely.
That,
and you mentioned,
yeah.
And you mentioned that like hopefulness for the relationship to improve in a positive way. Right. And so that kind of continues that cycle.
Oh, I love that point too, because that is so much of it. And, I think a lot of people can relate to that idea that you don't want to give up. I think a relationship, sometimes it can feel like you're giving up on the other person. Again, if it's a person who's been really struggling with a lot of things, that can feel really lousy to end a relationship with somebody who's got some problems, that you're aware of. And again, we can sometimes get really overt messages from people that it's wrong or it's bad, or, we're bad people if we're going to, leave somebody who's, lost their job or has, an addiction or financial problems or whatever it might be. So there's, sort of some stigma even around that, and social pressure sometimes to stay in those relationships. And an expectation that we're going to be able to, fix it. And again, it's a nice fantasy, but sometimes that's really what it is, a fantasy that, we're going to be able to change the other person, or, the relationship is going to be able to improve dramatically to a point where, we can all get our needs met and then it's emotionally healthy, or, and that, some major problems get resolved. And again, I don't mean to say that, major problems can't get resolved, but it's really important that we're looking at it from a realistic standpoint, and not from that fantasy place of, are things actually changing? Are people actually committed to doing the work that needs to happen, rather than just saying that they're going to, and then there's not a follow through? Again, it's a tough call to make as to, when do you leave a relationship, and, when does it make sense to stay in it? But I think it is important that, that we understand that it has to be, a two-way street here. It can't just be one person trying to do all of the changing and all of the work. That doesn't tend to work in a relationship, especially if the other person in the relationship has some significant personal problems that are, impacting the relationship problems. And if they're not actually willing to change those and, try to work on that themselves, without you being the one who's constantly leading that and, pushing that issue, right? There has to be some motivation, I think, on, from that other individual themselves. It's, more than just you saying you need to do it.
Exactly.
Day after day after day, right?
And you make that really good connection between like the people pleasing, right? And then the codependency. Could you maybe describe a little bit more about like what people pleasing would look like and some tangible examples?
Yeah. So people pleasing is, I guess it's similar to what the name, the phrase means. Really is that what we're doing is we want to make other people happy with the actions that we're doing. So it could be something like, I don't, like I accept an invitation. I don't say no to something because I'm afraid that the other person is going to be disappointed if I say I can't, come to that party that you're having. It could be something like that. So there's definitely a connection with, boundaries there, that we're saying yes to things that, really don't work for us or that we don't want to do, because the other person's need is, in our minds, more important. And again, I would say there's a level of discomfort with the other person's negative view of us or their negative feeling towards us. So I think there's both maybe a magnification of how upset you think the other person is going to be with you. So in this example of the party, let's just say, you've invited me to a party, and I don't want to say no because I think you're going to be upset. In my mind, it might be that I think you're going to be like at a level 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. That's how angry or upset or disappointed you're going to be with me, which is often an exaggeration. The truth might be that you might be, at a 4, like that you're really going to be a little disappointed, but it's not going to be, a deal breaker in our relationship. And then the other piece of it is that partly because I have magnified how upset I think you're going to be, but also partly because I feel really uncomfortable with your disappointment or displeasure or anger towards me. And again, this can sort of connect back to some of these other things where it really can be that I feel like the relationship is going to end if you're that angry with me. So there's both a belief that I'm not going to be able to handle it. Like I won't know how to make amends with you or work through the relational piece of it. And just as an individual, it can just be super anxiety provoking. Like for some people, it really, they can really shut down and feel like I just can't cope with you being upset with me. So it's much easier for me to just say yes, to go to your party. And even though maybe that's going to cause me some anxiety or some, maybe it's going to cause me a financial problem or a time management problem, who knows, like whatever my issue is with it, it's, maybe going to cause me some other problems. It's both that I feel like, well, I'll manage those problems more easily than I could manage you being angry with me. So again, it's very much of like, my needs are not as important as your needs. And I don't know what to do, with people being upset with me. Like that just feels so huge to me that I can't figure out how to do it. So I just try to avoid it all of the time. Right. So I think there's, we could also say that probably, there's, another string of it is, what we would just say is, conflict avoidance too, right? Because we're assuming there's going to be a conflict, when there might not even be in a lot of situations, when you're going to do something that the other person might be, a bit upset about, it's probably not going to be a big conflict. Right. Oftentimes it can just be, okay, I'm disappointed that you're not going to be able to come, or, that's inconvenient for me, or, but again, folks who are real people pleasers and real conflict avoiders, they avoid it so much that they really don't know exactly. And I think it's hard for them to gauge how upset people are going to be, or, what the outcome might be, because they try so hard to avoid it all of the time.
Or I can think of an example if someone were to say, oh, I'm really unsatisfied with my partner and the way that they communicate with me or behave with me. And then there's like this idea, okay, well, have you shared that with your partner? And it's like, well, of course not. They would never be able to speak to me about this. So I'm just going to go along with what's happening instead of actually going, how do we manage the emotion so that you can communicate effectively?
Yeah, I think it's very overwhelming. For people. And again, it becomes sort of that behavioral pattern that, I sort of know how to deal with the discomfort that it's going to cause me to do the people pleasing. And that's something that I'm used to, essentially.
For sure. What would you say are the best ways to manage that over magnification of the fear of the other person being very upset?
Well, I think, even just asking ourselves the questions is a good place. And I think even just like considering the fact that, like, am I, is it possible that I'm anticipating the worst, right? Am I sort of catastrophizing? Am I thinking this is going to be a huge deal? And what's that based on? Like, is there any evidence? Like, has that happened before? Or has it happened with this particular person? How can I want to sort of get as much information as I can, I think, to determine whether my expectation here is realistic or not. And I think one thing that can be helpful for folks is, trying to not put everybody in the same bucket. And by that, I mean, like, don't assume that everybody is going to be mad at you all of the time for, everything that you do that, is not 100% what they want. Like, if you can almost think about, different people in your life and say, okay, well, my boss, when I, have to, displease her, she really yells at me and she calls me out in staff meetings, and it's really horrifying. And like, that really happens, but then I think about, okay, but with my sister, is that the same? Or is it like, if I can distinguish that, what, she actually is different, she'll say to me, I'm disappointed, or, I can sense that there's a small amount of displeasure there, but we work it out, and it's different. So again, once I can make these distinctions, I can also, start to respond differently with different people and in different circumstances, rather than just, again, sort of like being like, I need to avoid all of this across the board with everybody in every single situation in my life. Because if we have some people in our lives, and hopefully, everybody has a couple of, what I sort of call safer people, they're the ones that, are not going to be as upset. And again, the emotional, intensity that they give off is less, right? Then those are people that it's going to be easier for us to practice making some changes with. Right. So it generally, it's not good to say like, okay, if your boss is the person who has the biggest, strongest negative reaction to things, maybe that's not the place to start. Maybe in this situation, like, start with your sister, because that, you have a relationship there, that you can work through some things, and you can, maybe even ask her a few questions about, her feelings about this. And, it doesn't feel as scary that she's going to, like, berate you, in front of the whole family or something, like what's going to happen at work. So again, it's just making some of those distinctions about, and remembering that not everybody has that same amount of emotional upset about things.
For sure, definitely. And would you be in agreement with this idea that we don't make other people feel a certain way? We just have an impact on other people's feelings.
Oh, 100%. I mean, even if I was just talking about that situation with this, imaginary boss, I mean, it definitely comes to mind. I mean, it's like, if your boss is yelling at you, I mean, even if you did something truly that, like, you made a mistake that was significant, you also need to remember that, like, in this situation, like, that boss clearly has some kind of issue with her own emotional regulation, right? Like, that's not a professional workplace, kind of behavior for sure. I mean, I would probably say it's not really great behavior, even in your personal life. And it's not effective communication either. But right, we have to remember that, yes, just because you're sort of the one who has, maybe sort of triggered it, if you will, with a response, that doesn't mean that you're the cause of it. Even when people say you are, right? Or even, sometimes people will say it, or sometimes we'll just make the assumption that, I made a mistake. That was sort of the thing that now my boss is yelling. The truth of the matter is, your boss could be yelling because a whole lot of things went wrong. And, your mistake maybe was just the last, straw kind of situation. But even so, I think, to your point, I mean, somebody else's reaction, somebody else's feelings are theirs. And again, this is very much, at the core of codependency is, for folks who struggle with codependency, partly because there's so much discomfort with other people's sort of big emotions like that. There's a tendency to want to, fix that and, say, it's okay. What can I do to make it right? And sort of, help the other person calm down, when that's not necessarily your job to do. It depends on the relationship and the situation, but, I'd certainly say if this is, your boss at work, it's not your job to make your boss feel better. I'd say maybe, a little more complicated if it's, your spouse or your parent, but bottom line would still hold that it's still not your responsibility to manage other people's emotions. Part of that is because you truly, you can't. Again, sometimes we can, offer, some understanding or to listen to somebody, but that's different than trying to fix it for them and help them, almost sort of force them to feel better. Like they've got to figure that out for themselves.
Totally. And I think it's almost like a big surprise when you're maybe with a client and they go, this person made me feel. I'm like, whoa, I didn't know they could control the neurotransmitters in your brain and the way that you are interpreting this. And so it's a big unlearning of this idea, because I think, would you agree that throughout childhood, we're taught like, hey, when you do that, that creates that feeling for that other person. So trying to have that conscientiousness, but it's like unlearning that, yes, be kind, be respectful and all of that. But you don't control or completely impact or completely implement that emotion for that person. And so it's like being conscientious of your behavior, but knowing that there's an impact, not a creation of emotion.
Yeah, I think for a lot of folks, they feel like emotions are kind of a mystery, like they just kind of, show up randomly and nobody has any control over their emotions, which I would disagree with. I think we actually have a lot more control over our emotions than we think we do. And we certainly have control over, or we can learn to have control over what we do with our emotions. But again, there is a connection between, what we're thinking about things and how we're feeling about them. And we can certainly control what we're thinking. Again, it takes some practice and some learning, but it is tough because a lot of times, a lot of people grew up in situations where, yes, they were told that they are responsible for their parents being angry with them, or even like way out there things like, you're responsible for dad losing his job, which is like, as an adult, you can think like, well, how is that possible? Like, that makes no sense. And yet as a kid, you believe it because you believe, pretty much, what adults tell you. And you're trying to figure out how to make sense of things that are going on in your life. And you both don't have all of the information. You also don't have a lot of life experience. You also don't have a fully formed brain, who can really think these things through. So, you sort of come to these conclusions about things, like it must have been me. Like I must have, been such a bad kid that caused dad to lose his job. And then it's hard, surprisingly hard, it surprises me, it's surprisingly hard to sort of undo that way of thinking, because I think it sort of got in there, at a time, again, when you were little, then it made sense. And you just kind of, repeat that to yourself unconsciously, and you find other, sort of pieces of evidence as you go through your life that support that idea, that just make it seem really true for you. But, you can stand back, and look at somebody else's, thoughts like that and say, doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're looking at it, from your adult perspective. But even though we know that as adults, it's still hard to untangle, I think, some of the things that we started to believe when we were little.
For sure.
So, sometimes, it's just a place to start is to just question some of it, and not just take it as fact.
For sure. And know that it's okay that if someone doesn't like what you have said, that doesn't mean it's wrong.
Absolutely. That's a good one. Seems really simple, but it's not.
So tough, right? Because it's like that link between us as human beings being empathetic and understanding and not wanting to hurt others. So we say, okay, I'm just not going to say no or set that boundary and just go along with it because I don't want other people to be hurting.
Yeah, I think it's a great point because, we want to be in connection with people, right? That's a real, human need, that we're going to have connection. And I think, again, sometimes that unfortunately means that we will do things that are not really helpful or healthy for us to try to maintain connections. I think probably coming at that with a false belief that, maybe this is the only connection that's out there for me.
For sure. So it sounds as though boundaries is kind of like the next step for when you're having codependency. One of the ways to work out through that is through boundaries. So how would you describe a boundary, and what would you say someone should kind of keep in mind if they want to set a boundary?
Well, yeah, boundaries are really important in all of our relationships, and they serve a couple of different functions. So one piece of, or one element of boundaries is that they are kind of that dividing line that almost separates who I am from who you are. So, you can sort of almost imagine sort of an invisible boundary around you that, establishes, that you're a unique individual person, with your own ideas and your own values and your own thoughts, rather than that kind of extension of somebody else that we talked about. And this kind of boundary is really important because it helps us understand what we're responsible for. Right? Because if I have an understanding of sort of where I end and where you begin, then I also understand what I'm responsible for and what I'm not responsible for. Because if I think I'm responsible for you and your life decisions and your feelings, as we've talked about, those are things I really can't do much about. So it's not gonna be a satisfying endeavor for me to try to control those things. But I also end up, feeling guilty or, blamed for things that I really couldn't control. There wasn't anything I could do about them because they're outside of that boundary. And then another aspect of boundaries that I think most people are familiar with is a boundary as a limit. And again, we talked a little bit about this already, but, the boundary is that way of distinguishing what's okay with me, or like what I'm willing to do, or what's an acceptable way for you to interact with me. And it can also be a limit that we set with ourselves. So it can also be an element of like self-management that, we have to sort of manage our own behavior as well. We can't let ourselves just do whatever we want all of the time either, right? That's part of being, a responsible adult, is that, I need to go to bed at a reasonable hour, and I can't, drink a whole bottle of wine every day or whatever the things are, right? I have to have some limits to manage my life well. Just like I would set, limits for a child so that, they can manage themselves and learn how to interact with other people. So part of, overcoming codependency is learning to set boundaries. It's not the entirety of it, but it is an element. And I would say, for anybody, you need to be able to set some boundaries with really everybody who's in your life, whether they're somebody who's really close to you, or even, whether they're a stranger. We all have, certain things that sort of are like, this is okay, and this is not okay with me. And that's really like a very simplistic way of looking at a boundary, is for me to be able to, articulate that. And they really do come out of our needs. So it starts to get a little bit more complicated when we think about it. But, if we're going to set a boundary, it's, coming from a place of what is it that I need in this situation? And that informs what the boundary is, that I'm going to set. So if we go back to that example of, if I am, going to set a boundary and say, I'm not going to come to your party, that is coming from, well, I need to do, something else at that same time, or I've been, way overcommitted and I need time to rest. It can be, the need can be all kinds of different things, but that's really what, sort of drives the boundary that we're going to set.
For sure. And they make a good point because a need is different than just the want. The want is something that could be used to maybe have the boundary a little bit more controlling out of a place of control versus a need is more fulfilling like that self-respect.
Yeah, it gets complicated for people because for folks who, again, struggle with boundaries or codependency, they often discount their needs. And so it's very easy for them to almost think like my need doesn't matter, or like oftentimes I'll hear things about like needing to rest. Like this is one that again is very much that people will discount that. I'm tired or I'm getting sick often. I'm, feeling overwhelmed, and like all the signs are there that you need rest. Yet it very much so people will be like, no, like I have to do all these things. There's a reluctance to almost sort of believe that is valid, that I need rest, or I mean it could be other things, a need for respect, a need for time alone. Again, I mean these are all things that are completely valid needs, but people have a hard time seeing them as valid, as true, again, because if you've lived your life in a way where people have not acknowledged your needs or not been interested in them, or they've been, you've kind of had to just minimize what you need all the time because you're so focused on other people's needs, you almost don't even recognize a need like that when it shows up.
Definitely, for sure. I think that's a really great example of like that need for rest, but putting that aside, but then they're acknowledging that they're super tired, but they're not going, hey, like I have to set this boundary. I need to get my need for rest fulfilled.
Yeah, right. And again, you sort of see that connection there. Then you're sort of in this people pleasing place of, I don't want to upset somebody else. I feel like what they need is more important than what I need. And then eventually it catches up with you, right? Because rest is a real need. And if we don't listen to it, eventually then, you get burnt out or you get sick or, I don't know, like eventually your body will say enough is enough. I can't just keep going on like this, right? So that's definitely a need that you can't ultimately ignore them. They For do sure. Eventually, say, this is true, this is real.
Yeah, definitely. So we've kind of touched on today codependency. We've talked a little bit about people pleasing. We talked a little bit about boundaries. Is there anything else you kind of want to share about specifically?
Well, I think that's probably enough for today.
Okay.
And I hope folks can see like that they all sort of intertwine. That no matter which piece of it, I would say kind of resonates with folks is that that they all do interconnect.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Right.
They're all connected. Definitely. I really appreciate speaking with you today. It's so much valuable knowledge. I think I've learned a few things, which is so wonderful. We thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
For sure. And if anyone wanted to reach out and find like some of the work that you've done, how could they maybe check you out?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is livewellwithsharonmartin.com. And then I've got a couple of books that I've written. One is the Better Boundaries Workbook. So that's definitely pertinent to what we've talked about today. And the other one is the CBT Workbook for Perfectionism, which we didn't really get into the perfectionism piece today, but that does connect in there as well with a lot of those kinds of issues also. So those are available from any major bookstore.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Haley.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.